Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over the top 10 best decks heading into the NAIC, the largest tournament in the year, the first IRL tournament with the Paldea Evolved set legal. This is the last chance saloon for many people's Worlds invites as well, so a massively impactful tournament. And this is the format that we will have for Worlds as well, giving us that sort of starting point to see what the best lists are heading into the World Championship. So many reasons to have our eyes on this event. One of my favourite ones to watch throughout as well. So many great players all attend the NAIC, so it's going to be a fantastic spectacle. Let's get into that top 10.
Yeah, and we're going to kick things off with Rapid Strike Box. So Rapid Strike Box is a deck that sort of was quite popular towards the, or it was talked about quite a lot when Scarlet Violet was first released as sort of this big way of countering Lost Box, and it does that really, really well. The biggest issues it's always had, though, are kind of these weird consistency issues. But it does have very, very sort of positive matchup results, which you can see at the bottom there, which we've taken from Trainer Hill. So thanks once again to all of the data that we get from there. It has overwhelmingly good matchup results, but it always has this sort of hiccup of actually just getting into the game. Realistically, it actually gains some, or the existence of Iona is really nice for the deck because there's less random judges in other people's decks. So you're still able to draw up to 6 cards a lot of the time because much like something like a Kyogre Lost Box deck, this is a deck that takes a lot of prizes all at once. And because of that, you're not really affected by Iono. You're instead just building up your combos. Maybe you're taking a prize here and there. But in general, you're looking to have this big Medicham and then rapid flow turn, moving lots of damage counters around, this kind of thing, and take essentially 4, 5, maybe even 6 prizes across a couple of turns. So Iona really isn't affecting you as much as other decks. It's also a great tool for you to use as well. It's an additional couple of draw supporters. This deck at times even played things like Judge, which just felt horrible. So yeah, it's really, really nice in terms of gaining a little bit of consistency there. We also have things like Squawkabilly as well, which is something that is another way of helping increase that consistency. If you decide to play it, it helps you just tear through an extra 6 cards and try and get towards the towards these combos in your deck. Try and find all of the different pieces, all of the different Pokemon that you need to evolve, because there's multiple stage 1s you need to evolve, and it's really important to be able to do all of that. The other big issue for the deck in the past has been Mew. Often lists playing double Drapion V, sometimes even the V-Star and stuff like that as well. Just loads of really sort of aggressive ways to deal with Mew. We now have Spiritomb, which is another way of dealing with Mew, but it's obviously a 1-prize way, and also can just sort of sit on the bench and you can forget about it in that matchup. You don't have to worry about using it to take a knockout and it getting lost owned or anything like that. So it's a much nicer passive way of dealing with Mew. So a lot of these little things here and there that were causing Rapid Strike Box issues are sort of amended with Paldea Evolved. Now it definitely still feels like there are some consistency issues there. You still have to get multiple stage 1s out, sometimes 3, 4 different stage 1s out across the game. And still being Iono and stuff will obviously naturally pull away these combos, but it feels a little bit stronger, I think, and definitely one to keep in mind, especially given that there are definitely still some very, very popular and good matches for you up at the top end of this top 10. So yeah, taking a look at the list, it's very similar to lists we've seen in the past. Basically, like I mentioned, able to cut down on the Drapion pieces and just play a Spiritomb. We've also squeezed in that Squawkabilly as well. In general, the rest of the deck is pretty much just solely focused on trying to get into the game and be as consistent as possible. Heavy sort of supporter line, heavy ball search line, and just making sure you can get to the point where you're able to pull off these powerful combos, often revolving around Radiant, Alakazam, and Yoga Loop, and being able to take multiple prizes and sort of win the game from there. So pretty bog standard list, but one that hasn't really changed too much, but some definitely some nice consistency pieces there. In terms of other options, Luminion V is kind of an obvious one. You're able to naturally play that to try and pick up some of these supporters to help you get through the early turns. That in combination with Squawkabilly kind of fills your bench up with a lot of fragile 2-prize Pokemon, especially when you need to have you're quite a board-centric deck anyway, but it definitely can help out. Clara's another sort of piece of the puzzle that can mean that you're Pretty happy using research and Squawkabilly and things like that in the early turns because you're able to Clara all the pieces back on those key turns, ready to try and take multiple prizes. It's also not a draw supporter, but if you're able to use Clara on one of the 2 turns that you get with Medicham, it's like you still have access to a draw supporter before or after as well. And similarly with Boss's Orders is obviously just a really, really powerful card. Naturally, because this deck deals with the bench quite well. There's not as much of a need for Boss's Orders because there's other ways of damaging your opponent's bench Pokemon. That's basically what the deck focuses on. But it's still really important to have access to a resource like this at times. So keep it in mind as well.
On to number 9 then, and we have Lost Zone Giratina. I still keep really enjoying playing this archetype because you actually have that breathing room now. The Jet Energy, such a great card for smoothing out that deck, so you can ramp your Lost Zone quickly, and Giratina always kind of suffered by having too few switch cards whenever I played the archetype. And Jet Energy makes that happen in a really space-efficient way, as does Super Rod. The new inclusion from Paldea as well really helps out, so you don't have to rely on a supporter like Clara, when this deck would much prefer using Colress, or some hand disruption supporters like Iono coming into the deck list, as well as Roxanne, especially because with the Jet Energy inclusion, we're moving away from Temple of Sinnohs more often than not and playing Path of the Peak instead, which is proactively disruptive against Lugia, very frustrating for Guardian in a mid-game situation, and is just very nice and disruptive against a number of archetypes. So this deck actually can have a really good defensive mid-game, which I think is quite appealing for me, to be honest. You are still trying to juggle that multi-prizer that can hit through other multi-prizes very well as having the option to change gears and go to a single prize game plan with the Radiant Greninja, which is a constant threat that the opponent has to respect, and of course Cramorant for, tempo hits, as well as Sableye. The matchup spread is pretty interesting for Lost Zone Giratina. A little bit sketchy against some of the Lugia stuff. Definitely, of course, doesn't like Gershi Intel because it pings down Comfey for fun. But overall, not too shabby, honestly, and these are much better stats than we've been seeing the last formats for Giratina, so it's got a marked improvement from the past. It certainly is a better deck. The deck list hasn't changed from the channel. I think if you are looking for space, you can go down to 2 Super Rod in this list. It just gets a little bit cheeky. And there are a few other things that people might want to experiment with. But yeah, this is a pretty nice cookie cutter, simplistic 60 with not too many tricks up its sleeve. For other options, you could try and improve that Mew matchup a little bit more. At the moment, I'm just playing Cleansing Gloves, which is that soft answer to allow Giratina to reach to 310, which obviously also helps out against the Gardevoir matchup. But you could have a harder tech for Mew if you're expecting it to be popular, with either Spiritomb or Drapion. Sort of take your pick. They both have big upsides for different reasons. Drapion obviously being like a worse card that could be a lead in the deck for you, but also has upside of potentially being a gate target against Gardevoir as well. It could just be instantly put into play to respond on a Gardevoir EX. So there are some upsides to Drapion besides being a Mew card. And the Spiritomb, sometimes you could block things like Luminion against Lugia as well. So yeah, upsides for both of these. It's sort of take your pick for teching out your list. Snorlax could be really interesting as well. That Thumping Snore, still a very powerful option when you have gates at your disposal. This can be really good against the colorless builds of Lugia for responding on opposing Snorlax, where you don't have many good one prize options that could do that for you otherwise. And it's also very good at dealing with Gardevoir that have put Reverse Energy on themselves as well, because they stay out of range of Sableye and Cram. So that could also be quite handy when you're facing other one prize heavy builds, essentially. Then Temple of Sinnoh could find its way back into the deck list. I have just said how Jet Energy is so important for the archetype, but just playing one of these to allow you to have a Roxanne turn, essentially, against a Lugia, and then you're turning off Gift Energy is big, but also turning off V-Guard Energy to be able to Lost Impact through Arcs and Lugias is pretty massive as well, so that could also find its way into the deck list as a 1 count, just to add to your overall stadium bounces.
Next up, we have Arceus V-Star. Basically, the Arc Giratina is the Arceus build that we like the most. We feel like a lot of the other Arceus builds aren't quite there yet. Arctina is basically just this one of these decks that is just going to be looking to disrupt with Judge, Path of the Peak, and Iono in the late game as well, and just try and stop the opponent from really getting set up and into the game whilst throwing lots of big 2 prize Pokemon in their face that are just pretty efficient attackers. There's not masses and masses that's really changed with the list. The inclusion of Flying Pikachu, I think, is probably one of the most notable things to deal with a couple of matchups that would otherwise sort of give you some headaches here and there. You still have the great engine overall, and you can see by the results, sort of the matchup chart down at the bottom, there's actually a lot of above 50-50s, which is pretty typical of Arc decks, but it's a really sort of good thing to think about when going into a tournament where you're going to be playing against pretty much everything. We'll talk a little bit at the end about sort of how the whole metagame looks, but you could really be playing against a lot of different decks. So having a deck that does the same thing every single matchup, does something quite consistent, and does it pretty much against every single deck is actually a really, really nice thing to think about. And you're not going to have to really worry about what your opponent's doing. You're just focusing on using Arceus, using the like Judge Park combos, using Giratina as and when you need to, and just sort of keeping that in mind every single game is actually something that's really appealing. So yeah, it could definitely be a really nice pickup for this tournament. Taking a look at the list, again, pretty standard stuff. Like I mentioned, we've added in Flying Pikachu. This is the list that I think both Joe and I have been playing around with a little bit, both online and in IRL testing, and it feels pretty much like any other Arc deck does. It's really important to get these first couple of turns sort of locked down, getting Arceus and Energy, and getting a Bidoof down here and there. But the addition of Iono as well as Judge means that you have a lot more ways of at least doing small amounts of disruption in the early game, but you also then have some great disruption in the late game in terms of Iono as well. So in general, it just feels like it's one of these decks that's just really going to try and stop your opponent from actually finishing their game plan, which is something that I think has been really good against a lot of the lost boxes in the past. And naturally, even though sort of it's had issues against Guardy as well, I think having a few more sort of disruptive tools here and there, in that we're also looking to disrupt them as much as they're still playing their own Ionos as well. Disrupt them out of some of the pieces they're trying to use here and there. It's way harder to actually get these big Guardy combos if you're constantly applying pressure and that kind of thing. We've still got the cleansing gloves as well, which I think Joe kind of mentioned when talking about the other Tina list, but it's still really important for Mew, as well as being able to take out a Guardy. And then, like I mentioned, the Flying Pika in there as well, just to clean up a couple of matchups as sort of it really helps in terms of, I think basically Baxcalibur is the biggest one for it. It actually really shows up that, which is nice. Other options include basically leaning a little bit more into the Mew counters, like we mentioned with the Lost Tina list. Being able to play a Drapion or play a Spiritomb is definitely never really going to be a bad idea. I think Mew is going to be really popular. It's done well in Japan, and it's definitely sort of like a fan favorite deck, I think, for some people. So I would expect quite a bit of it. Sharon's Care is obviously a great way of trying to still stay tanky, and Jet Energy is also another nice tool for sort of getting out of the active when your opponent has hit into one of these big 280 HP Pokemon, and they're just sort of preparing to knock it out on the next turn. You can sort of Jet Energy and combine that with a Judge or an Iono or something, can try and make it difficult for them to actually take these two prizes later on in the game. And then there's also the obvious options of just trying to make the deck a little bit more consistent. Trekking Shoes has been in and out of the deck pretty much the whole time. The new addition, maybe Squawkabilly. Squawkabilly is a nice way of trying to just turbo to make sure you can get that Arceus Energy attachment turn one, because it's basically all these Arc decks ever look for. So it could be a nice option. It's kind of scary putting a 160 HP 2 prize Pokemon on the bench, though, because one of the really nice things about this deck, as I mentioned, is it's just survivability, and the fact that it's got 280 HP on basically all of its attackers. This kind of sort of undoes that a little bit. So yeah, it's a little bit awkward actually having to put the Squawkabilly down, but the benefit that you get in terms of being able to just attach an energy and actually get into trying to go for Trinity Nova turn 2 is really, really beneficial. So yeah, definitely one to try out for sure.
In at number 7 then, and I'm really tentative with this one, we're putting Chien-Pao Baxcalibur with Palkia. Its online data is pretty horrific, actually, but do bear in mind that this archetype has been experimented with a lot. It's been the most played archetype over the last couple of weeks in online tournaments, and the lists have got a lot of variety in there. People are trying out all sorts of different stadiums. In some cases, it's heavy item usage and Pokestop. That's the one we're currently leaning towards with cross switches in the deck list. But there's also like conventional support accounts in there with just high counts of bosses orders, researches, Ionos, that sort of thing, alongside the Irida, of course, which is kind of the thing stitching this whole archetype together. It seems like the general consensus is that Palkia is too good to cut, but there is a debate whether you should play a 1-1 or a 2-2 count, because typically you're using it mainly for its V-Star power, which you can obviously only use once. And then there's the backup of Bibarel, which is also sort of between, some lists play none, actually, and a number of them play a 1-1 or a 2-2 line. So people are really debating what the best counts are for Chien-Pao. It's certainly still being solved. It's by no means hit its ceiling just yet. And this archetype does have a lot of big selling points. That Hellblade can one-hit KO everything in formats with enough energy is available, and you have the consistent pressure of Radiant Greninja. A lot of these Chien-Pao lists are playing either Cancelling Clone or Lost City, so you can remove a Manaphy in one way or another and make sure that your Greninja is getting into the mix. So it certainly can take multi-prize turns even against single-prize decks, which is obviously a big upside. So the selling points are all there. We have a relatively solid engine that we have seen from Iono in the past alongside Palkia many times over. So we know that the elements are here for the archetype, and it's just really about making it work. Here's the list that I'm currently on, and I really like the high Pokestop. Even though it's a card that you won't slam turn by turn by turn, it's a card that you love to see in the opening hand, especially when you go first, because we are a very heavy setup-based deck, where we need to get those Friggy-Backs or Palkia, one of the two in the opening stages. We love getting early Greninja and cycling those Water Energy. We love finding Bidoof early as well, so slamming an early Pokestop to give yourself those options of Nest Ball, VIP, and Ultra Ball, which I'm playing in all fairly high counts, is really handy. But then you also have the sort of panic option of like, okay, well, I'm digging for energy retrieval often in the mid-game is a huge card to look for. Obviously, slamming that Pokestop and then combining it with an Irida that's already in hand to allow you to have cross-switcher plays can be huge as well. So you're also playing a Rod and 3 superiors already, so you're not too worried about many of these energy finding their way into the discard pile, and you can get away with certainly like the thicker part of your Palkia line hitting the discard pile with no ramification. You can see a Chien-Pao go in there, you can see part of your Baxcalibur line hit the discard pile quite happily. It's only really supporter cards that you're worried about finding their way into the discard from Pokestop, so I much prefer these, but I know there are big upsides to Lost City as well, which I just mentioned, not just for Manaphy, but also as you're knocking out certainly Ralts and Curlies and whatnot, you're simply denying the opponent that option for the remainder of the game and depleting their resources as you go, which is quite helpful for a deck that does like to play the aggressor in the Gardevoir matchup, which is certainly one we have to be aware of. And then there's still, of course, some Skaters Park lists going around as well, which helps you ramp to higher damage output Hailblades, which again can't be understated of how important it is to reach those higher damage output thresholds at different times. I'm just playing the one cancelling right now and hoping to Irida into it on the turn we can cross-switcher, because I feel like the immediacy of going Cologne and targeting either double Comfey or targeting double Curlier or Ralts before they evolve up is so much more important, but it does mean that you need to have really ideal turns for that combination to come together, whereas the Lost City can sort of happen at some point in the game, knowing that Gardevoir are damaging themselves enough and the opponent is constantly super rolling back their Gardevoir pieces, that there will be opportunities for you to Shuriken at some point. That's almost always the case. So yeah, this deck will find a way to get its Greninja into the mix. Onto other options, yeah, the stadiums is the big debate. That's the thing I see kind of the most debate over, as well as just the thickness of Palkia and Bibarel. Those are the things that people are really going back and forth on. Kyogre is a really solid attacker, which I really, really liked when I was initially testing it. It's great into Guardy. It's really good into Lugia as well when they're not able to collapse away their Luminions. It's essentially a win condition in a card, but I'm so worried about the consistency of this archetype that it hasn't really made the cut in my current builds, but there are big upsides to that powerful sniping option. It's just the headache of your opponent is already trying to protect against sniping naturally in the deck, so maybe it goes alongside Lost City a little bit better, knowing that you can turn this online in later stages of the game. And then just making your Irida more versatile, the options of Lost Vacuum rather than having to physically have stadiums, which, yes, I'm playing 3 Pokestops, it's a fairly high counter bounce path, but it's not as safe and secure as having one of those stadium counts turning into a Lost Vacuum for Irida options. And then Rope, at the moment I'm playing Switch because I'm already playing cross switchers, so it's a bit of a debate there if you want to play Rope versus Switch or play 1-on-1 as well, especially because the list that I've shown isn't playing Skater Spark, so you are a little bit light on those pivoting options. Just things to bear in mind, but I feel like we're slowly edging closer to a Chien-Palkia, and even though we put it quite low, watch this space because it could either explode and have this incredible finish from a list that has been built way better than any of us just yet, or it could do the other way round where it starts Miraidon-ing and going down that tier list because it's not consistent enough, and this is the best it gets, and unfortunately its matchup data is quite poor right now. We're very cautious on this one because the strengths are there, but the list isn't quite there just yet, I don't think.
Next up, we have Mew VMAX, and realistically, this is mainly the Fusion build because the DTE build is just hurt way too much by various different things. But the Fusion build is kind of the one that did really well in Japan. It also was already actually kind of picking up a little bit of popularity in current format anyway. Obviously, winning regionals and stuff. So it's like people were already prepared to go back to the Fusion build. But it turns out the Fusion energy is basically the perfect way to stop Spiritomb from disrupting you too much, and Ice-Q and Lost City have kind of been come in as sort of additions to those to then deal with the Spiritomb and forget about the Spiritomb, and then you're just sort of playing the super aggressive Mew deck as we've seen, which is really, really interesting. Again, the matchup data we're showing both matchup data, but Mew's kind of always been one of these 50-50 decks where it draws a lot of cards and just gets into the game a lot more than a lot of other decks. But you can see it's still got some very positive matchups, which is obviously really nice as well. So yeah, this is, whilst we don't have necessarily much reason to play the DTE build anymore, there's definitely always been some benefits to the Fusion build, and having this variety of attackers in there is going to be, I think realistically, the way that we're going to see a lot of Mew built going forward, and especially for NAIC. The list is pretty standard, realistically. We've got the Meloetta for dealing with multi-prize threats. We've got the Ice-Q for dealing with these one-prize threats, in particular Spiritomb, but obviously it's great for dealing with the early Rolts and Curliers and stuff like that as well, which is really nice. Couple of, as I mentioned, a couple of Lost City as well, just to try and make sure that anything that you get rid of isn't coming back, and really try and still have this potentially disruptive approach in your aggressive deck. You can also see that we have got, indeed, an Iono. We've got a combination of Iono, Judge, and Roxanne. That's because basically they all serve kind of different purposes. Roxanne, I think this is a deck that really actually still benefits from Roxanne because you draw so many cards. You're able to Roxanne on the right turn, which is really, really nice. You're able to combine it with a Path of the Peak or something like that as well, if possible. But yeah, you're still able to draw a lot of cards. But because you're able to draw a lot of cards as well, Iono is still obviously a great option for you because you're able to draw out of Ionoing yourself to a low hand size and still get there. So yeah, there's nothing too crazy about the list other than that. It just feels like it's still super consistent, draws a load of cards. And like I say, even though we've ranked this only at 6th, this was the second most popular community ranking. So I expect a lot of Mew going into NAIC. I think it's going to be a very, very popular archetype. I think evidently Spiritomb hasn't scared it off at all. It seems like no matter what card they print, this deck just will not go anywhere. So it's just about adapting, and when you're able to draw more cards than any other deck in the format, adapting is really easy because you tend to find your answers in the ways that you need to adapt. So yeah, it definitely feels like an archetype that's still here. I don't really know what card they can print at this point, but yeah, it's going to be a popular one, I think. Onto some other options. Obviously, Deoxys has been in and out of the deck. Deoxys is actually a really nice attacker into things like Lost Box, but again, we've chosen to go with the Ice-Q. Ice-Q can take a couple of prizes here and there, but obviously is susceptible to cram way more so than Deoxys, so definitely one to keep in mind. Maybe you want to find space for a Deoxys instead. And similarly, Hisui and Heavy Ball, a lot of the time in old Fusion lists, there was multiple Meloettas or whatever, but now we're looking at playing a variety of different attackers. You might want to try and slot in a Heavy Ball as well, just to try and make sure you're able to find the right attacker in the key matchup. Obviously, there's a couple of other options that you can have to help with the Lost Box matchup. We've seen things like Collapsed, Stadium, Penny, and Manaphy all be in and out of the list in terms of dealing with Lost Box in different ways, whether it's Manaphy stopping multi-prize turns from things like Kyogre on the key turns that you're trying to like Roxanne them and stuff like that, so it's difficult for them to deal with. And Penny and Collapse just basically not letting your opponent start putting a lot of damage counters onto things like Genesect to take multiple prizes. Again, both of these seem like very, very valid options. I just really like double Lost City right now because there's so much you can do once you're actually not worried about things like the Spiritomb and stuff. And I think there will be some amount of people that just sort of throw a Spiritomb into the deck and think that will be fine. So being able to Lost City it away, and then all of a sudden they like don't necessarily have that sort of safety net of Spiritomb anymore, I think is going to be very, very powerful. So yeah, I think Collapse is definitely an option, but I really like double Lost City right now. Finally, some supporters that we've seen in and out of Mute in the past, Avery being able to try and limit the opponent's bench. There's obviously lots of setup decks right now, so still being that aggressive deck whilst also drawing some cards and limiting the opponent's bench is obviously nice, as well as Silene to get back certain resources. I think in general, power tablets are still super important, but even being able to get fusion energy back and being able to like double dip on Ice Cube or something is something that I've actually seen happen a couple of times. So yeah, it's definitely, you know, there's options there. I think personally, we just leaning into trying to be as consistent as possible and having just the disruptive tools in like Iono and Judge, plus the aggressive tools in all the power tablets and Sparkle is more than enough. And a lot of the time you won't really need Silene, but you know, there's times where, you know, there's enough that you burn through the deck that you end up having to get these resources back. So definitely one to keep in mind. Like I say, I think this is going to be a really popular archetype. I think there will be a lot of people that try it out. I think there'll be a lot of people that try and throw in a Spiritomb, like I say, and don't really actually get that much value out of it if you respect the Spiritomb and learn how to deal with it. So definitely one to keep an eye out for. I think it will be one that does quite well, and I think even though we've only ranked it at 6th, it's definitely one that you should really keep in mind and test against.
Next up, we have Single Strike Lugia, and yeah, we are splitting up a few of these archetypes because we think they are different enough and have slightly different matchup spreads. The benefits of Single Strike is that we have that higher damage output threshold at our disposal, in part thanks to that Single Strike Crush from Tyranitar, but we are also having the one blow option still in the deck list with Urshifu, so you're not getting trolled by Duraludon for one thing, you're not getting trolled by Flying Pikachu for another, so there are still reasons to like the Urshi. Of course, it's a very good card against Arc decks in general, which we are still rating fairly favourably, so yeah, there are still reasons to like this higher damage output option, and it actually gains a few nice cards. First of all, like Jack has said a few times throughout the video, that with less panic judging that people are doing against you in the opening stages, now you get hit with Iono and still see 6 cards, which means you actually can still make your Lugia combos happen that little bit more often, which is always nice to see. And you get to play Iono yourself now as well for some disruption, whereas previously Lugia just played a couple Judge, and it was horrible to play the Judges yourself, but also less disruptive as you work towards the late game. Whereas you're fairly actually happy seeing Ionos to an extent, because you're proofing yourself throughout the game with gift energy usage on a number of your Pokemon, so provided the opponent doesn't go for a Iono plus Temple play, you're going to still end up with a decent hand size, which is great. And we get to play Jet Energy in the deck list as well, which is huge because we have many 3 retreat cost Pokemon in the deck list, so we have had awkward situations of really painful retreats here and there that can cause headache for the Lugia players and put you low on resources or put you off your sort of ideal attackers at different times. So having these Jet Energy just sort of clears up that little bit of weakness that we have seen from the Single Strike approach. Other than that, it's really close to the Reagan 60, as it's been dubbed due to his constant success with that archetype. The only real changes are we're seeing Ionos come in instead of Judges, and we are seeing some Jet Energies take away from the V-Guard and Gift Energy counts, just to add in a couple copies of these, and then you gain a space by having to, or getting to cut the Penny/Thornton that you would play in the past. Now, Urshifu isn't guaranteed anymore. I did mention a few reasons why it's still reasonable, and I think if you are landing on the Single Strike build, you should probably be playing either Urshifu or Duraludon yourself, because if you're not wanting to have the wall-breaking element of this archetype, you could just play the colourless build, and I think that one works slightly more because you don't have to fit in urns and whatnot and have slightly less easy to scatter energy around. So I do think you should always be playing a wall breaker of some sort if you're going for the Single Strike approach, but if you do just think that T-Tar is that good, you can try and make some spaces, cut that Urshifu, maybe gain back an extra energy slot, maybe gain back an extra supporter space or an extra stadium slot. Those are the things that I would try and work into the deck list, if anything. But that's where I'm at the moment with my Single Strike. It's very similar to the ones we've seen time and time again with a lot of success. So you know that you're playing a list that has good pedigree behind it, even with these new inclusions. As I said, Duraludon could come in if you're expecting a ton of people to jump ship from Single Strike and go to Colourless Lugia. You get to play Duraludon and pounce on them, essentially, is the idea. We saw that at the EUIC, where a number of Lugias weren't prepared for the Dura Impact Energy tech, and that could end up being the case again at NAIC if you want to be dangerous with your Duraludon. There's also the option of having Luxray Reversal in this deck list, just to give yourself another good type coverage available to you, and to be kind of have a softer answer for the mirror than a Duraludon, but still have a nice bounce back option, which is always pretty cool. And then the Thornton, it wasn't just in here to sort of help out against Morwan and a few other things. It was just a decent card for you to, you know, get rid of a fish or turn a Yveltal like back into play and immediately earn and just power it up all over again, which is a really big attacker in this format. So there are reasons to also like this kind of techie supporter card that doesn't come off in every game, but does really surprise the opponent when it does and completely turns matchups on its head.
Onto the other build of Lugia, sort of the new age build of Lugia that's come because of Paldea Evolved. This is Lugia Lax. This is sort of colourless Lugia that has less single strike attackers and sort of a little bit less oomph, but more one prize attackers, and I think more annoying one prize attackers. And from the Magic results, you can see that this still has some pretty favorable results into some of the more popular decks. I actually think this is the Lugia build that I'll rather be playing against pretty much all of the decks that we're going to talk about going forward. So if you're expecting quite a really refined meta around the top, or what are considered the top decks in things like Lost Box and Gardevoir, for me personally, I'd rather be playing a build like this, because I think Snorlax is just such a really strong card in terms of dealing with those decks. It presents a lot of issues for them, but on top of that, there's still that push potential that the single strike build has with things like Drapion V and Weird V. So yeah, in the same way as the other build also has gift energy protection, so does this deck. And there's a lot more flexibility, I feel, with this deck as well, because it's playing the full 4 count of Jet Energy, so you're able to move around and be a little bit more fluid compared to the single strike build, which is often just sort of throwing a really strong, hard-hitting Pokemon in the active and kind of saying, deal with me. This one, like I say, feels a little bit more flexible and a little bit more fluid. Onto the list, and the list is again quite similar to what we've seen in the past. This is actually a list that me and Joe have pretty much been sat on for a little while now. We're both testing this deck quite a lot, and really enjoy it. It's got the Luxray Reversal combo, which I think is a key piece for the mirror, as well as just being kind of that third Snorlax, or just another annoying Pokemon that realistically your opponent has to deal with just because it's such an efficient attacker. And you're pretty fine going behind on prizes. You're naturally going to be putting a 2-prize Pokemon down in the early turns, maybe even 2 in terms of also playing a mini and get into the game. So I think there's going to be a lot of situations where you do end up finding yourself low on prize or behind on prizes to be able to actually make use of Luxray and Reversal. And then the double collapse is kind of something that we're both a big advocate of, basically, because once you've gone behind on prizes and once you've done all of the 2-prize stuff, you can really make this deck very, very 1-prize centric in terms of Snorlaxes and stuff. And basically then just using the 2 prizes towards the end of the game, using things like Drapion and Weird towards the end of the game, when you're closing out the game with the last couple of prize cards, you're for the mid game, you can actually become a very, very 1-prize centric deck. And when your 1 prizes are things like Snorlax, it's actually really difficult to deal with for things like Lost Box and stuff. In general, the rest of the deck is pretty much just lots of ball search cards. We've got the A-Spec Great Ball, which is something that's we've actually seen massive value from, but that definitely could be, it's definitely like the most flexible slot. That could be, another energy card, or so some of the other cards that we're going to talk about momentarily. And the rest of the deck is just sort of, like I say, making sure you're playing as much ball search as possible to try and guarantee that summoning star turn 2, and then just focusing all in on making sure you're able to Snorlax as much as possible, Luxray as and when you can, and then try and close out the game with a Weird or a Drapion. Onto some other options. Radiant Charizard Luminous Energy is something that definitely seems like it could see play as another late game option. We've already got a couple of late game bombs in the deck, but this could definitely be added as a third. I think it takes up probably maybe 2, at least 2, maybe 3 slots, which is obviously something that you then have to look at in terms of maybe having to cut another energy or cut an additional ball search card or something like that. But it could definitely be beneficial in terms of, again, having just another late game bomb. Bravery Charm is a card that's been quite popular in some of the online lists. essentially making Snorlax even tankier. I think we think realistically Snorlax is kind of tanky enough, just having that inbuilt ability, meaning that Lost Boxes actually have to go through all 150 HP in an attack rather than sort of cleaning it up with Sableye or anything. And a lot of other decks can quite easily go over the top of it, but just have to commit to going over the top of it. Bravery Charm doesn't really change numbers too much, but definitely could be used in terms of trying to make the Snorlax a little bit bigger. And Pumpkaboo is obviously always one that will be in and out of lists, trying to make sure, obviously, the main turn for this deck is turn 2 Summoning Star, and Path is definitely going to be the card that tries to put the spanner in the works the most. We have 4 stadiums right now, but that could definitely be 3 stadiums and a Pumpkaboo. I think Pumpkaboo's, whilst having all the ball search to try and find Pumpkaboo, I actually find it a little bit less reliable, and I think the benefits to double collapsed are so high. It makes the deck really it makes it very difficult for other decks to deal with when you're able to collapse away some of your 2 prizes, that I think the benefits outweigh the drawbacks from playing Pump. So definitely one to keep in mind, but I think for me, double stadium or double collapsed 4 stadiums in total is the way I would want to be playing it.
On to our number 3 then, the hardest deck to play in the game, but we've seen that pre-Paldea it has, with the right pilots behind it, the opportunity to spike so many tournaments, and that's because Kyogre is still the best attacker that we have in the game. It can deal 250 to 2 different Pokemon once you set your deck up properly with energy recyclers and now super odds, which actually really help this archetype out a little bit so that you don't have to play 4 copies of recycler. You can weave in some rod as well, which then gives you some nice Pokemon recovery, which previously you might have to commit things like Clara to, and Clara doesn't really help you get to the bottom of the deck and could sometimes just be milled from your own Pokestops. Now you have a bit more freedom to Pokestop, which is always great because this deck wants to hit the bottom of the deck as quickly as possible so you can formulate your Storm combo. And naturally, because you're able to take 4 5-prize turns, all with 1 Aqua Storm, if you set it up correctly with your Sableye usage, and just take some cheeky prizes in the opening stages, you play around Iono quite well, and you're essentially just getting judged very often with this archetype after you've taken those few prizes, so it's nothing that you're not used to and haven't had to play around before, which is great to see. The only sort of headache is that there are simply more Ionos around. There's 3 and 4 copies in many archetypes, which means you are sort of getting hit with that hand disruption slightly more frequently, perhaps, which is something to be slightly aware of. But this archetype doesn't have to rely on the Aqua Storm combo. Sometimes it's just a comeback play, and sometimes you'll go down a completely different direction. Sometimes you just win from Sableye usage. Sometimes you just win from early Greninja plays, just like any other Lost Box deck. So you have those avenues still to go down in many occasions, but Kyogre is just that big finishing option for you, which is very powerful. And although it doesn't gain too many new cards, I think it's been such a strong threat pre-Paldea that we have to still give it the respect it deserves for the players who play it so well in these tournaments over and over again. You have to expect some of those NA players who have piloted it for many months now to make some tweaks and make it once again a really high tier, very dangerous, threatening archetype in the game. The list I'm going to show is just a 1-prize based build. I think very often you will also see builds that play just the Dragonite, Raikou, Forest Seal Stone package, and is kind of hybriding between that sort of turbo approach, but also still has the Kyogre late game package. But I wanted to show some variety for the archetypes because we're also going to have turbo on this top 10 list at some point. So I wanted to show a slightly different approach, which is kind of more forgiving in that you only give up 1 prize a turn in the majority of situations. And you can see that this list still plays 1 Clara and the 1 Palpad, but is leaning much more into that item usage. Look how many items this deck list plays. And like I said, because you have Rod, you don't even care about things like Kyogre milling itself from Pokestop anymore. You can just slam that Pokestop time and time again and know that you're going to be pretty okay with almost every outcome, and everything is helping you just get to the bottom of the deck. And just with this high amount of item cards, you're seeing and keeping 2 or 3 cards quite often once you've done your early VIP passes and whatnot, and you've thinned the deck of a number of these Pokemon. Yeah, you get immense value from the Pokestop. It's essentially a supporter on its own in this deck list, and if you can create those pathways for the Kyogre, The selling points are obviously massive, and it's just a monster of an archetype. So it's one that I'm going to stay clear from because it's too much headache, to be honest, especially for a tournament as big as NAIC or Worlds, where you have to play so many rounds and probably stressful rounds as well as you progress through the tournaments. So there's going to be a select few that do well with this. I wouldn't expect the masses to be picking up this deck, but I would expect it to also go deep in the tournaments. Like I said, there are a few other cards you could be playing. I think the Dragonite Raikou Forest is probably going to be the more popular of the variants, because we just know how powerful Dragonite is, and if you get that early Dragon Gale, sometimes that's enough. It can actually carry you through a number of prizes if it's not dealt with too easily, and there are a number of archetypes that can't deal with a Dragonite on the spot, which is actually very powerful. There is possibly a debate around stadiums. I've just been gushing over how much I love Pokestop in the deck, but there are a few other options if you want to have an extra switching option from Beach Court, or if you want to play the new Artisan Stadium card. The one thing that worries me about Artisan is it donates the opponent an easy way to get a Mana Fee out, which is something I never really want to do as a Kyogre player. So that's the reason why you're not seeing Artisan in the list. And some of the more successful Japanese Kyogre lists are adding a Zinnia's Resolve just to be an additional supporter in the deck. This is a way that you can actually get rid of VIP Pass if they're not finding their way via flower selecting, but is finding their way either from prize cards or just top decks into your hand. So the Zinnias can be an extra way to clear off some of this guff, which is also nice and just adds to your overall low support account, which I think is possibly quite a reasonable option.
Onto Turbo Lost Box, and it's a deck that we've kind of already talked about a little bit in terms of there's kind of this weird hybrid between these two decks. We've just seen the list that Joe just sort of presented was that one prize heavy list. There's also this list which basically doesn't focus on Kyogre at all, and then there's somewhere in the middle that realistically you can kind of see overlap between any of these three decks, but we're splitting them into Kyogre and Turbo. I really like the outlook for Turbo. I think being able to deal with the Iono problem head on by just basically burning through your deck and getting to the bottom as quickly as possible and doing all of your powerful stuff before the Ionos are really going to start becoming painful is actually a really, really cool way of handling the problem. It's just kind of saying, I don't really care, because by the time you're using Iono for any kind of powerful effect, I've already done all the cool stuff I can do. So yeah, it definitely feels really, really strong in terms. It doesn't feel any worse in terms of Iono, I don't think. I think there was some concern there. And like we said, naturally is going to be a lot more Iono or a lot more hand disruption in the format. But I think because you're trying to front load so much of the combo potential, you're not really too fussed by it. Similarly, we have things like Super Rod as well. It basically gains all of the same tools as the other Lost Box variants. And this just really focuses on trying to get some attackers on board early and try and shut your opponent out of the game rather than having this big late game swing. Things like Dragonite and Radiant Greninja basically trying to force your opponent out of the game and force them into having to sort of bench awkward things, find the Mana Fee a little bit early, or not bench a 2-prizer too early or anything like that. So yeah, definitely feels like an archetype that can still abuse the format and isn't really scared off by Iono compared to what we first thought. The list is pretty similar to ones we've seen in the past. We've got the Drapion, the Raikou, and the Dragonite package in here. So 3 attackers that are all hitting either hitting key weaknesses or just doing a boatload of damage to try and really, close out the game early. Other than that, it's just, I think Super Rod is a massive include for the deck. There was a lot of pressure on Clara sometimes, so being able to Super Rod plus still use some kind of draw supporter to get into the pieces kind of does the same effect as Clara, but means that you can still access things like Mirage Gate and stuff like that in the same turn, which is nice. Or just boss's orders as well, being able to Super Rod, find all of the pieces you need from flower selecting or just additional energy from Mirage Gate and things like that, and then still being able to boss's orders is going to be key. So yeah, a big addition there. This is definitely, I think, a really, really strong archetype in terms of putting the pressure on, but I think it also is another archetype that definitely is a thinker. I think it requires a little bit less thinking than Kyogre because, again, a lot of the time you're front-loading your thinking, you're front-loading your combo, and you're not really too worried about, do I need to thin this or do I need to hold this or leave it in the deck or anything like that in terms of whether Ionos are coming, because you've done all of that kind of stuff. But it's definitely going to be an archetype that people that you won't be able to just pick up and play just before the tournament. It requires some thinking, requires some testing beforehand, because there's, as with every Lost Box deck, there's still some intricate decisions here and there. Regarding some other options, Skyseal Stone has been in and out of the deck, and obviously is still an option. There's much when you're doing Skyseal Stone things, you're probably less likely to be able to have the big early game sort of Mirage Gate plays, but that can be offset by the fact that you're able to take an additional prize against some of these key Pokemon. So definitely could still see play. Similarly, Raihan, there's actually way less pressure on Clara right now, like I mentioned, because of the existence of Super Rod. So that means Raihan, I think, is definitely another interesting tool, because it means that you're able to find a key piece like a Mirage Gate or something, rather than having to rely on a Colrus or anything like that to try and get there, while still having things like Super Rod to shuffle in Pokemon and still get them out later on. Similarly, with the other Lost Box variants, Beach Court and Artisan are definitely options, but we've kind of, for the same reasons that they're in and out of lists, I still way prefer Pokestop, just because the deck wants to go turbo. And again, whilst it's not the Kyogre list, you still don't really want to give people early Manaphy, because you can actually Grinch things like double Curlier or double Comfey in the mirror if you don't put the Artisan down with Greninja. So definitely still something to keep in mind. Maybe worth trying to play it to get into the game, but I think there's going to be situations where it ends up hurting you more than helping you. And then finally, just a couple of other attackers. Obviously, Snorlax is always welcome in Mirage Gate builds. It's a really nice tool in the mirror, as well as just having another way of dealing sort of a big damage output in terms of not putting a 2-prizer down, but still being able to knock out something like a Luminion or something in a pinch. Similarly, Luxray and sort of we've seen it's quite interesting. Luxray hasn't seen masses of success so far, but I think it's something that definitely needs to be explored, because having you could even go as far as to say like a heavy Luxray build where you're playing a couple of reversal energy perhaps, and trying to have these as your basically your Snorlaxes, to try and maybe lose the first prize and then fill the board with some Luxrays and try and swing later on, trying to trade out with Luxrays. That could definitely be an option, but even just popping in a Luxray and a reversal feels pretty fair. The deck is great at tutoring. There will be awkward times where you'll find pieces of a flower selecting and wish that you were playing more, but that's the same as some of the other Lost Zone variants in the past. Sablezard has that exact issue by playing a Radiant Charizard as its like big attacker. So it's not really anything that Lost Box hasn't dealt with in the past. And as we've kind of been mentioning all day, Luxray, I think, is one of mine and Joe's favorite cards from the new set. It's such a powerful card, such swing potential against some of these matchups like Lugia and stuff as well. So definitely one to keep in mind in terms of you have to slightly adapt the deck list, but it's definitely one you can keep in mind. You can even like Mirage Gate and stuff to it as well, so you don't even have to try and fit in all of this stuff. It can just be a very simple one-off card that you end up finding in the mid-game, and you've noticed you're behind on prizes and you're able to start swinging with it there. So yeah, definitely a cool option that I think deserves exploring for sure.
And to no one's surprise, as the community are in alignment with us, and it's no surprise due to its amazing results in especially the IRL Eastern tournaments. Gardevoir EX gains so much from Paldea Evolved. It gets better Pokemon recovery from Super Rod. Now you don't have to play a supporter to get back your stuff, which is incredible. We get Reversal Energy, which makes your Shining Arcana Gardevoir so much more dangerous as a single prize threat, and is one of the best ways that Gardevoir can catch up in a prize race now, as it is setup based. It does require to cycle through the deck to start throwing those Psych Energy away and getting multiple stage 1s and 2s online. It takes a couple turns very often, and it means you're going down 1 or 2 prizes as you set up, but it means that Reversal Energy is naturally online for you to make those bounce backs, and at the same time you have Iono at your disposal. It's one of the best One of the best Iono users in format, and it's naturally safe against your opponents playing it against you as well, because you're naturally coming back from behind in a lot of situations. And because you have that one-hit KO potential from a one-prizer and from Zacian V still as well, you can make those comebacks happen, whilst also really just depleting your opponent's hand of resources to hopefully make it more difficult for them to respond with a next attacker here and there. So Gardevoir just gains absolutely tons of new stuff and is buffed from where it was, which was already a pretty powerful archetype, It's not all singing and all dancing, though. There are still issues here. We've just talked about Lost Box, and those matchups are still kind of awkward. Surprisingly, the Intel Urshi matchup is pretty bad as well. So these are things to bear in mind, and against a number of matchups, like even against Chien-Pao, even against Fusion Mute thanks to Ice-Q, you need to draw quite well and develop, a lot of early basics in a ton of situations, because you're looking to get as many rolls as possible. You oftentimes try and get that Mew into the mix, but also many archetypes force you to get Manaphy in the opening stages and just force you to draw even better. So there are still hurdles for this deck and still challenges, certainly. We have put the Reversal Guardi matchup data on there as well. It's not been played enough really to get a really good picture, a really good outlook of this archetype, unfortunately, and it's one of the more difficult archetypes to play. So I think take those matchup results with a pinch of salt, but just know that the Reversal Guardi is kind of more fragile, has a slightly weaker early game, but can create probably the strongest late game scenarios out of any deck in formats, in that you can essentially create checkmates where you're using Guardi to cycle through the deck the whole time, as well as the Mewtwo pieces as they go. You build a Mewtwo all in one turn, you throw an Iono at the opponent with just 1 or 2 prize cards remaining, and you're either sprinkling to finish off their engine Pokemon, or things that you've pre-damaged with your Shining Arcanas and Gallades, and even Luxray with Reversal Energy, and you've sort of peppered up these Pokemon around the board. You can take out multiple things all in one go, or you can just use a big Final Burn and just knock out the big threat that's in front of you, and just say, what are you going to do about it, because you have no hand. Sometimes you've been Iono-pathed, or sometimes you Iono-Sinnoh them, so yeah, you just create these horrible board states for the opponent to deal with, and I think, again, it's one of those decks where, in the right hands, could really do well in a tournament like this. Looking at the deck list, nothing too flashy at all with the list. It's very basic. It's just draw good, get your stuff out. Like I just said, you need to get many basics developed in the opening stages, give yourself the best chance of finding those fog crystals. I think that's one of the big differentials between the list that we've been testing a lot and some of the lists that I've seen online. A lot of people are playing one copy of Artisan. It scares me, Artisan, because even if you're helping Lost Box by getting an early Cram or getting a Sableye developed before you're using things like Iono and whatnot, it's a bit of a headache. You're just giving donations to people, which is never nice. Even in Mirror Match, it's a card that you don't really want to put down too often. So I rather just have Fog Crystal. It's got less diminishing returns as well, because you're always happy to turn attached Psychic Energy on floating Curliers and whatnot, or onto your Shining Arcana Guardies. You're always happy to Fog Crystal to start off your turn with Radiant Greninja to draw more cards. It's just a fantastic option to have. And of course, being an extra, or the same amount of outs as an Artisan would be, just to get your Ralts and Mew developed early, which is always really huge. So that's the kind of basic, straightforward list that we've come to see. I still really like Temple of Sinnoh. I think it's massive against Lugia, and me and Jack are big fans of Lugia, so it makes sense that we're wanting to tech against it. And the Collapse is massive for removing Guardi EX in a number of situations now as well. Especially with Reversal Energy, you get away with this a lot more, where your Brainwave is dealing so much damage as a one-prize Pokemon. You're happy to remove your Guardi EX from play and still have energy scattered around the board to take out your remaining prizes and whatnot, so that can often be a big card in the later stages as well. In terms of other options, I've just sort of made my case for why I don't really like the Artisan too much, but if you are that worried about Path of the Peak and Judge and whatnot, you can just play that extra Stadium, and I do think it's better than playing an extra copy of Temple or Collapsed, so it would make sense to be the next choice. Hisuian Heavy, actually a pretty interesting card that hasn't made its way quite yet into Guardi, but we're starting to get to that tipping point where there's enough Greninja in enough archetypes where prizing a Manaphy loses you so many games that you might want that Hisuian. It's a similar case for things like Ralts being prized when you're up against Lost City variants, which could now be Mew and Chien-Pao, so you might want to have a way to fish those out of prizes. Greninja, of course, a big card, so even Cress is a huge card. There's a lot of reasons to like Hisuian if you can make the space for it. It's just hard to make that space, unfortunately. There's the option to go heavier down the Reversal Energy route as well, and have probably a second copy. I have tried that just on its own, even without the Luxray, and it certainly does help out against Lost Zone box, because you can just sit there with a Shining Arcana Guardi hitting 150, which is a really good number to be hitting into these one-prize decks, and you're obviously an undamaged 140 hit point Pokemon, which makes them oftentimes get multi-prizes out if they want to insta-respond, or they're going to try and go around you, which is still fine, because then you're keeping Reversal Energy online and just putting them in the same situation again, whilst also continuing to draw cards and throw Ionos in the mix. But the Luxray gives you that sort of more proactive attacking threat as well. It means you may not even need to have any X in play to still be threatening a response KO on a Lugia or onto a Palkia, which is very good. And then in the middle, there's a Penny. And Penny's been in previous lists, and actually for the EUIC, it was sort of that tech card to beat the tech card, and that tech card was Mawile. And people are murmuring about just beating Guardy with that one card inclusion once again heading into the NAIC. It's once again that worst kept secret. I think Mawile in general is far, far worse than it was for the EUIC, because it doesn't counter Lugia anymore, because all the Lugias play Jet Energy. So this is specifically Mawile for specifically teching against Guardy and trying to trap, once again, those Greninjas and whatnot. So if you really want to play that Penny, you still can, and then you're covering your bases against the random people that shove in that Mawile because they don't think they have a good enough time into Gardevoir. So if you want to be one step ahead, and in fairness to Penny, it does allow you to aggro Roar the Sword a little bit more often, aggro hit with Zacian a little bit more often into Lost Box. So there are other applications for this card, but it's a sad state of affairs that people are going back towards that Mawile tech card for Guardy. So keep them in check if you really respect them.
Onto some outside the top 10 picks. We've kind of touched on a couple of these. Just quickly, I'll talk about you can see right there in the middle at the bottom, we've got the Mewtwo Gardevoir. Obviously, Joe kind of mentioned it, but yeah, it's a little bit more fragile, but has an insane late game. I've actually played this deck a little bit, and it's really fun to play. I don't think I would put sort of a whole tournament like NAIC on it, on its shoulders, because it definitely feels a little bit sketchy, but I think there's definitely something powerful there, and I think there will be a contingent of players that play it. And I think also that the list we've seen in Japan, even though they haven't been translating too well over here, this feels like one of those decks that, again, is quite breakable if you're able to make this a little bit more consistent than it maybe had seen already. It was already doing quite well in Japan in a couple of tournaments. It wasn't necessarily doing better than normal Guardy, but it had some respectable results. So this definitely also feels like an archetype that may be breakable, and I'm sure there'll be some kind of contingent of people that are playing it. Radiant Charizard Sablezard is the deck that I played basically all of Scarlet and Violet format. Unfortunately, I think this is the Lost Box variant that's hurt by Iono the most. Despite having less combo potential compared to the other two, you're still needing to find multiple pieces towards the late game in terms of being able to recycle Radiant Charizard. And naturally, where these Lost Box decks have been able to use Super Rod instead of Clara, that doesn't really work too well for the Radiant Charizard build, because you need exactly Radiant Charizard and Fire Energy in your hand immediately, so you don't really get benefits too much from Super Rod. I think there's definitely still room to play Super Rod, but you kind of need Clara in this deck way more, because you're not Mirage Gate focused or anything, so you actually just need immediate access to Charizard plus Fire Energy, so you don't get massive benefits, and obviously you're getting Iono'd out of your Claras all the time towards the late game as well, so you definitely hurt a little bit more. And finally, I guess I'll talk about Ting-Lu, because it's another deck that we've kind of played a little bit, we played a little bit in the early weeks of this, of the set being out. Cursed Land is actually a pretty powerful ability, and I think no one really denies that. The fact that it doesn't turn off Gardevoir has turned out to be a massive headache, which I think is to no one's surprise. The deck just still feels all sorts of clunky here and there, unfortunately. I think there will definitely be people that end up getting caught out by Ting-Lu, perhaps, because it can have some pretty powerful turns, and the list that we were sort of testing was able to quite consistently get Ting-Lu in the first couple of turns, and sort of got to that 4 prize mark quite well, but it always struggled sort of closing out the game. And when you've got that, plus the fact that it doesn't turn off Gardevoir, and you've still got to play a heavy 2 prize deck here and there, it all just didn't really work out too well. So I think it's definitely a risky pick. It really likes some of these other 2 prize matchups, because you're really, really tanky, which is pretty cool, and being able to turn off the abilities of things like Arceus and stuff whilst also being really tanky and hitting them for weaknesses, definitely a benefit. But I think it's a little bit too risky for a tournament like NAIC, when it's just all a little bit too inconsistent compared to some of the other decks that we've talked about today.
So finishing off the circle then, we have Arcdura, and this is kind of encompassing the Umbreon, the Flying Pika, the Vulpix, those sorts of things. It's a bit of a fall from grace for the EUIC winning list, and that's really because the deck doesn't have an engine. It doesn't really get to play things like Barrel and whatnot, because you're trying to use a 2 prizer than a 3 prizer. You would give your opponent too easy of a prize map in that regard. So you have to just play, you know, Poker Gears and just raw supporters. And that's really bad in a format where everyone can put you down to a 1 and 2 card hand sizes. You just won't have the combination of cards to close out the game that you used to. So unfortunately, I think this deck gets a lot worse. Now, Duraludon's weird, right? Sometimes there's enough Lugia that convert to colorless that you get free wins here and there. And yes, there might be enough situations where Vulpix can be powerful enough, and I don't think anyone's going to be cutting Memory Skip, but I think you can still get over the line there, but it's always a slog. So I think your deck is inconsistent from every turn of the game now. Essentially, apart from exactly when you're using Starbirth, your turn ones are so dicey, and there's even more Fusion Mew, so they pounce on you straight away, which is also terrible. There's one-hit KO decks from Chien-Pao as well, which is horrific for an archetype like this that just essentially relies on its size, and you really can't do much about that. So yeah, your matchups get far, far worse, and everyone's hitting you with Iono, so that kind of sucks. Like I was just saying with Chien-Pao against Duraludon, it's also one of the reasons why we think Goodra's having that fall from grace. It doesn't like seeing Chien-Pao in the mix. It doesn't like seeing the uptick in Giratina builds again, so that's quite awkward for Hisui and Goodra. It does gain the same things that the Tina build gains. It gains that Rod, it gains the option to play Jet Energy in a decent count. So its own 60 actually is getting a small buff, a small improvement, but its matchup data is just terrible. And also Reversal Energy going into Gardevoir is also really bad for Goodra, that's kind of just hoping to tank all the time, and you're just not being able to make that come together. I think the one that's probably one of the most promising, the Guardian, the Miraidon Magnezone, actually, the final one to touch on, just because we have that internal consistency from Tandem Unit is really good. I actually really like Magnezone still. I think it's an excellent card, and we've seen that Chien-Pao, a big part of its win condition is trying to just deal with Manaphy and then take your multi-prize turns, and Magnezone does that in a very easy, convenient 1-1 package. It's very good against Lost Zone Box. It can be powerful against the Guardi players as well. And if you choose to play the Fluffy build, you have 1-hit KO potential from Raichu. If you choose to play a Regieleki build, you're pushing your Miraidon's damage output to much more appealing numbers as well. So there are still strengths around this archetype. If nothing else, it gets into the game quite often. Your RNG comes in the form of your generators, of course, which sometimes is a headache, and that's why it's not seeing top-tier play. But I feel like it's kind of being underplayed in this format for how reasonable I think it is in terms of just being in the game in a number of situations.
So the final thing we wanted to look at is just how we've sort of come to these results. So a combination of the online CP from all of the online tournaments, plus also the sort of the top decks from the actual IRL tournaments that we've seen for the various tournaments that have had Paldea Revolved or the equivalent. We've kind of combined all of the CP in terms of the decks individually, but also in terms like the archetypes individually, but also sort of combining the archetypes. So you can see that Gardevoir consists of the Gardevoir plus the Mewtwo build, all of the Lost Boxes together, all of the both the Mew decks together, that kind of thing. So yeah, this is kind of the foundation for where a lot of our thinking sort of was at, and a lot of where our decisions sort of began. Obviously, you will have noticed throughout the video as well the online community sort of ratings for these decks as well. So thanks once again for everyone who decided to pop in and sort of leave their vote on that. It was really, really useful to see sort of where the community were at as well. I think that often gives quite a good indicator of popularity of decks, as well as sort of necessarily how strong they are in the metagame. So that could be a good thing to keep in mind in terms of maybe how many times you're going to see specific decks. One thing that me and Joe have discussed quite a bit whilst making this video is the fact that there feels like basically every deck, realistically every deck in the top like 6 or 7, but realistically every deck in the top 10 is something that we could see someone doing well with, someone going quite deep into the game with, deep into the tournament with. Naturally, things like Lost Box and Gardevoir are going to be more popular and are probably going to go deeper than most of the others. But realistically, like we could definitely see pretty much any of these 10 decks in the top 8, and it feels like there's sometimes with the sort of the layout of the format and the top 10 list style videos, there's formats where there's a clear difference between the first few decks we talk about and then like the next few decks we talk about. But it really, really feels like there's basically 8 very, very viable archetypes in this format. There's definitely, like I say, stronger ones and weaker ones, but I think there's no reason, like I would never be surprised at someone saying playing Lost, one of the decks that made top 8 being Lost Tina. I could definitely see that. So it's going to be a really, really interesting format. And I think whilst we only have like 1 week of cup data before NAIC, and then like a couple of weeks of cup data before Worlds, it's actually going to turn out. I was a bit concerned about how this format was going to work because it's basically two big tournaments with almost irrelevant tournaments in between. But I actually think it's going to be very, very interesting in terms of seeing how NAIC turns out and how we have to adapt for Worlds, but also how like whether anything completely new stands up, because when you have sort of 3 or 4 very popular archetypes, it's quite easy for a new deck to sort of sweep in and deal with those really well and appear. But when you have to actually take into consideration 8, 9, 10 different archetypes, it feels like there's actually not there could be some room for creativity, but it's going to have to be really creative, I think. So yeah, I'm really interested to see whether it's just these sort of 10 decks and variations of, or whether there's anything that anyone's been cooking, because yeah, things like Chien Pao and Guardian Mewtwo definitely feel breakable, I think, and we've just kind of got to wait and see whether there's something that everyone has missed that ends up tearing up the tournament over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, great shout. And we're actually going to be playing some of these new format tournaments as well, just for a bit of fun as well in the next few weeks. And you're completely spot on. I think I could easily see myself taking any of the decks in the top 10 to these tournaments and have a good chance of doing well with them. They all have really good benefits to them as well. So even though we're seeing a massive CP out front for Guardy, as we know, people are happy to counter the best deck in format, and Lost Box is a very good deck in general that happens to also be reasonable into Guardy these days as well. So there's going to be a bit of a power struggle between those two, but then there's other archetypes in the mix that can certainly throw their hat into the ring. I think for me, if I'm picking up any deck at the moment, it's going to be either Colorless Lugia, because I'm just enjoying it a lot, but also I really still like Arc Path Disruption. I feel like it's still just a very, very solid approach to the format, so those would be my personal picks right now. But if you're asking me what I think is going to be most likely to win, I would still probably say Gardevoir overall, because I think it still just has the legs to go far often enough in tournaments and just be very powerful, even when it is public enemy #1, because it's just so versatile and well-rounded. But that's it for NAIC. Did you want to jump in with what you're going to be playing over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I've started, like I said, I've been playing Sableye or Sablezard this whole format, but I've started playing some Gardevoir in sort of the back end of the Scarlet and Violet format. So I'm pretty sure I'd carry on playing Gardevoir. After playing some Paldea Evolved Gardevoir, going back to Scarlet and Violet Gardevoir feels woeful, and it still feels really good. So yeah, Gardevoir I think I would definitely just be playing, even though it is public enemy #1, like you say. I think the deck is so strong that it almost doesn't matter. It's just incredibly like versatile in what it can do. But I really like the sound of Turbo Lost Box as well. I think the two best decks that we've talked about today are genuinely just head and shoulders the two best decks in the format. So they're going to be what I'm kind of toying around with. For now, I can definitely see myself still picking up something like a Lugia or something, because it's a little bit less thinky. But I think whilst we don't have the pressure of big tournaments, we get to play in some cups for a few weeks. I think I'm going to be trying out some of these more fun archetypes and testing my brain a little bit, because yeah, they're both so fun to play. So yeah, in terms of what I actually think will win though, I actually think we'll see a lot of Gardevoir up there, but I can see a Lost Box making its way and feasting on the Gardevoirs. So I'm going to go Lost Box to win, but Gardevoir would probably still be definitely like a very, very high placement deck.
Very reasonable, right? This has been a long one, but I feel like it's worth it for the tournaments that are upcoming, and everyone is going to have their eyes on this one. So thanks so much for sticking around if you made it all the way to the end, and we'll be back tomorrow with another video. Cheers.